G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our final poll position for the year. It's our fortnightly show where all year we've taken a deep dive into the last fortnight in politics and the latest results from Guardian Essential Poll. This, as I said, is our last show for the year, so thank you so much for coming along today. I do want to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. Just to note that we still have one or two more webinars to finish out this year, so you can head on over to australiainstitute.org.au to find those. Later this week on Thursday, we're going to be talking to Finnish education expert Pasi Solberg and AEU Federal President Karenna Haythorpe about improving equity in the Australian education system a decade after Gonski. That's part of a special series that we're doing with the Nordic Ministers Council called Nordic Talk. So we hope that you can come along to that. And next week, we'll be talking to Katharine Murphy once again, but this time about her quarterly essay, Lone Wolf. So head on over to our website to sign up for those. Just quickly, you can type in questions for our panel today using the Q&A box, and you should be able to upvote other people's questions as well. A reminder to keep things civil and on topic in the chat or we'll boot you out. And lastly, a reminder that this is a live event and it will be recorded and go up on our YouTube channel later today. And it will also become an episode of Guardian's Australian Politics podcast tomorrow morning. And for those of you who are listening on the pod, you can find all the results today at essentialreport.com.au. So it's the final weeks of the year and the final weeks of Parliament. The government has just announced a deal on its IR legislation with the Greens and David Pocock. The legislation for the National Anti-Corruption Commission is expected to pass pretty soon. And of course, we've seen the Nationals coming out to say they're going to oppose the Indigenous voice to Parliament. And now that's putting some pressure on the Liberal Party for how they're going to respond to the referendum next year. On energy, the government is trying to come up with ways to soften the blow of an expected 50% increase in electricity prices coming down the pipeline. So, and the Prime Minister has just got back from an overseas visit as well. So there's, as always, plenty happening in politics, often more than we can fit into one webinar. And to discuss all that and more, I'm delighted to introduce our regular panel today, Katharine Murphy, Political Editor at Guardian Australia, and Pete Lewis, Executive Director at Essential Media. Katharine, if I can start with you. We're kind of winding down. It's been an enormous year, including a federal election, but we're just not quite finished yet. Parliament's still going. So what's happening up there at the moment?
Well, yeah, it's H for hectic, obviously, in the final sitting week of the year. Yes, Ed, we've had two budgets this year, an election and a transition, and we're not done yet. And we've also just seen the sitting calendar for next year today, which looks pretty heavy. So anyway, that means lots of fun and games for next year. But I think, as usual, you've summed up beautifully about where the various sort of issues are converging. The issues at the moment are the voice. Obviously, the National Party expressed a view about that yesterday, that they would oppose the concept, and it's fair to say that all hell has broken loose on that this morning. The Liberals seem to still be kind of stalling, and I say that actually in a complimentary way. The Libs haven't been herded into a position yet on the voice, although I note that John Howard a couple of weekends ago in the Australian gave Peter Dutton some free advice about how the Libs should oppose the concept and not give anyone a conscience vote. But anyway, that's all sort of working its way through the system. The big legislative things, as Eb says, there's a deal on IR reform, and so we expect that package will pass by the end of the week. We also expect the National Integrity Commission to pass. The debate has started on that again in the Senate as we speak. And there was a flurry last night where it looked like the Greens and the Liberals would impose an amendment into the proposal that was unacceptable to the government that involved the the Parliamentary Oversight Committee's input into the appointment of NAC commissioners. The Greens have stepped back off that this morning. The Greens are now supporting an amendment from David Pocock, which, to sort of simplify this, the Liberal amendment would have required the appointment to be carried by a 2/3 majority of that committee, the Pocock amendment by a simple majority. Now, I think of all of the amendments in the Senate, the Pocock amendment may get up if the Liberal Party supports it, and then it'll be a judgment for the government about whether or not that is acceptable when the bill goes back down to the Parliament. If we sort of take the Attorney General's temperature, it sounds like the government's not intending to countenance more amendments to that. So even if it's amended in the Senate, that amendment may be stripped when the bill goes back down to the House. Anyway, but that's all still to play out. The other big one, as you say, Eb, is energy, which has been a big issue for much of the year and certainly since the budget. The government is working through a regulatory response to try and bring some power price relief to both industrial users and households. Cabinet had a conversation about that yesterday morning. My intel from that is that the government's pretty confident that it can launch a price intervention for gas and make a difference. The government is less confident that it can impose a wholesale price cap for coal, which is significant if you live in the east coast of Australia. I know people join us on the show from all around the country, but if you live on the east coast of Australia, most power generation on the east coast is still coal generation. So they may need some cooperation from two states on that, Queensland and New South Wales. The Prime Minister made it clear yesterday that he will be trying to persuade premiers in around the country to sort of get on board with the energy regulatory package. So we expect to see that, I think, probably sort of in the second week of December in terms of when the rubber will hit the road on that. So yeah, it's hectic as all get out, as final weeks always are, and it'll be hectic until the senators and people from the reps stagger home on Saturday, I think, which is their current plan, late Saturday.
Yeah, Pete. And it is that kind of time of year where just everything's happening all at once in an effort to clear the decks before Christmas. But how are things looking in polling terms in Guardian Essential Poll?
Well, we've been getting our house in order for the end of the year as well, and we've conducted our review into the federal election, and we've also put out our primary and 2PP plus for the first time since the election. So if you want to share the slides, I'm happy to sort of open the kimono on that one. We shouldn't do that on a Zoom.
I was going to say, is everybody ready for the kimono? Close the kimono.
Anyway, here we go. Here we go. So the top line there was essentials final call. If we recognizing that that's taking the don't knows out as it got closer, we weren't far off 1 point, which is, a fair shake in terms of predicting the 2PP result. I don't think you could say the poll failed. If you go to the next slide, we did under call both of the. We overcalled both of the major parties. So our final primary label was 37. The AEC, it was 33, Coalition 39, 36. We underestimated some of the smaller parties. We've been reflecting on whether that was just, a statistical blip or something more fundamental, as we do after every election. What we're doing, one of our anchor points in terms of our sampling, without getting too geeky, has always been to have the party ID. So we ask people, regardless of who are you going to vote, which party do you feel closer to? And this was a really useful tool when it was really a two-party contest, because we could pick up if somebody said they were normally a Liberal voter and they were looking elsewhere, or normally a Labor voter and looking elsewhere. It was a good way of anchoring our vote. Now, what I think has happened over the last couple of terms, as more and more people go away from major parties, is that party ID is becoming more fluid. You know, it used to be that your party ID was like your footy team. You were born to it and you kept it, and you might vote different ways, but it was an anchor point to make sure our sample was on solid ground. So what Gavin and the team and John have done over the last little period is to recalibrate how we do some of those anchors. And so we're going to shift away from party ID and move more to stated previous voting intention. So that's kind of a bit like how the engine's going to work under the bonnet. But we've, you know, done what, you know, all people that are involved in the political process should do, which is to review, reflect, and revise our methodology after the election. So we feel like we can throw our latest polling out. And, you know, the other thing, if people have been with us on the journey, 2019, we made the call that we would start keeping the don't knows in our sample as a bit of a, you know, as a bit of a reaction to the horse race that just gave the false impression one side of politics was ahead or the other, or was it more than 50%? Although on these numbers, even with the don't knows, Labor is more than 50%. But the second was to really discipline ourselves, not to sort of look at it in terms of a horse race. And so while this is interesting, we don't think it's the most interesting things we're polling. But that said, how does Labor end the year? On 2 PP plus with the don't knows in at 51 to 43 with 6% undecided, quite low undecideds there as well, which is interesting. It was being polled in a week where there was a state election. I don't know if I can attribute too much to that. The Greens finishing the year in a strong position, up from the federal election on 13, Labor 33, but with those 6% undecided still in the mix. Coalition, not quite as bad as Victoria, but not very far above 30, and that growing base of other independents, which is obviously a movement that has probably not fired quite as well in the Victorian election as it did in the federal, but there are definitely people moving away from the major parties. You know, if you just do the sums back on that trend line, sorry, if you go back that slide, Eb, it's basically a third now, the two major parties and other parties. So that's the recalibration in Australian politics that we've been, I think, living through over the last couple of terms. And I believe Katharine might have a thing or two more to say about in her upcoming quarterly essay, which I'm looking forward to reading over the weekend.
Yeah, Pete, and we might come back to the Victorian election as well, but do we want to just go through these?
Yeah, we'll go through a few more. Yeah, so this is, again, right, we've changed the way that we rate, we monitor the performance of our leader and opposition leader. Like, we've traditionally said approval in performance, which I guess for a prime minister and opposition is not an actual fair race. And likewise to preferred PM, we don't think is that useful either, because one's the PM, the other's not. So what we've started doing is asking people to rate on a scale of 1 to 10, positive, negative, about how they feel about them. So it takes it, in a way, we're trying to see how the two leaders are portraying themselves to the public, but sort of untethering them from the office, because it creates a false anchor point as well. And as you can see, Albo's in the positive, 46 think, you know, he's either a 7 to a 10, whatever that means to individuals is up to them. Obviously, 26% in the neutral band, 4 to 6, 23% in the negatives, which is pretty low for a leader when you think that, you know, there is one side of politics that's job is to sort of make people feel negative about you. Peter Dutton not going quite so well, 33% negative, 32% neutral, 28% positive, with 8% unsure and never heard of it. So what does that say? I think Labor would be happy with where they are. They've got a leader who's in net positive, significantly positive territory, and they've got, you know, if there was an election held, which there isn't going to be for a couple of years, they'd be in a good slot. So, you know, that doesn't, it's a bit of a barometer at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah.
Direction that, yeah, go on.
Yeah, so that's kind of reasonably steady, but starting to decline. Is that just kind of the end of the not that they've had a honeymoon period, but the further we get away from the election and more into the nitty-gritty of governing, you reckon, Pete?
Well, I think this direction of Australia, for those that are listening on the pod, so we've been asking this every month. This is not about the government, this is about the country. And straight after the change of government, right direction 48, wrong direction 27. That is narrowed to 44 right, 36 wrong. I would read that more about the external economic circumstances, the high, prices, electricity prices, rather than necessarily that question does not link to the performance of the government, but it does talk about the overriding, circumstances. Before the election, we're in net negative, wrong track, over right track. So, you don't want to be governing when people think you're heading in the wrong direction, but also you can't control all those levers. Although I think over the last few weeks, Albo's been doing a bit to try to shift some of them.
About this next question on attitudes to the way Australian media covers politics.
Yeah, so I did want to ask this in the context of our review of polling. One of my bugbears, as some of the listeners would be aware of, is that I've been calling on the press gallery to review their own performance in the last election. So I just thought we would do a bit of a situation analysis there. That slide appears a tiny bit messy, but what we've got is 62% of people saying the media treats politics like a game. Doing those sums on the slide, 55% believe it is biased to one side, although I would note that people of all voting persuasions think the media is biased, probably against them, because you do read what you want to see. And then lower than you'd want numbers in terms of whether people feel well informed about federal politics, and whether people believe the media covers the issues that matter to them. Sorry, that slide's a little bit misconfigured, but do you want to just stay on that for a sec? Because on the media stuff, I do think that it's hard, isn't it? We've got, and I'm interested in Katharine's thoughts on this because we have spoken about it in the past. Like, I reckon both the Victorian election this week and the last federal election provided false narratives, but they did not provide, I do not believe, a fair appraisal of what the contest was. And that was because of the way that the media has come to cover elections as kind of almost a tabloid generated day by day little fight club with a set piece where the leader puts themselves in front of a bunch of cameras and journos who want to make a name for themselves, present company accepted. And I just wonder if the same way that we recognised after 2019 that polling wasn't doing the job that it should do, where is the conversation about the way, the role the media should play in elections? And I know we can talk about accountability, and sure, but real accountability is not about whether or not Dan's become a dictator, or whether he slipped down the stairs. It's not about whether Albo can remember figures off the top of his head. And I just think that I'm not sort of throwing all the media in the one basket or anything, but I am asking the question, where is the self-reflection, or is it just that the caravan moves on and the gallery keeps covering what comes next without taking any responsibility for its performance? So, Katharine.
You happy for that to go in this direction, Em? I'm just checking back in. Yes.
Yeah, no, I think.
Sorry, I've hijacked this. Bloody media.
But I think it's worthwhile reflecting on, in the context of the Victorian election, like I saw that front page with the steps, and it, you can see where they're kind of leading the audience. But if you're just reading that with a generous interpretation, what was that story about?
Yeah. No, and I don't, by asking whether our lovely host Deb is on board with this change or this segue, it's not that I'm reluctant to enter this fray, because I write about this a lot. I think, look, in general terms, I think the media is much better at requiring others to be accountable than to be accountable ourselves. I think, just as a general proposition. We're very focused on our accountability role in the democracy, but if someone requires us to be accountable, that often triggers a hostile pushback from us. Now, one of the reasons is because journalists sort of temperamentally and professionally are very focused on the importance of free speech, free opinion, free discourse, and these are really important principles to uphold. So that's why some journalists get very toey about what they would regard as excessive regulation, because there's sort of a difference between regulation and having a state-controlled media, right? So that's sort of just context, right, for why these things can get a bit prickly. But no, I mean, I said at the time during the federal election, it gets a run in the quarterly essay, which is now in the public domain. That I think there was a dynamic in the federal campaign that was more like pub trivia than about a sober, sensible accountability process. And obviously readers and viewers noticed it, and a number of them were unhappy about it. I think the reasons why the whole sort of accountability dynamic on campaigns has become more posturing and performative would be a whole podcast or webinar in and of itself, because there are complex dynamics sitting behind that shift, some of them inside the control of our profession and some of them completely outside it. So what I'm saying is, I think as a general rule, we can be hostile when asked to be accountable. As a general rule, we're covering election campaigns less well than we did in the past. But the reasons for both of those propositions are complicated. And again, one day we can do a whole webinar on this subject. But look, I didn't see much of the Victorian election coverage because I was out of the country for the sort of the critical bit. I think in the campaign I was following Anthony Albanese around Southeast Asia, so I didn't see a lot of it. A colleague and a friend of mine, Matthew Ricketson, who is a professor of journalism at Deakin University, wrote quite a good comment piece about this, which was published on The Guardian yesterday, if folks want to chase that up. I think it was a really nuanced bit of commentary, actually, about why sort of performative accountability actually creates the conditions for real accountability to be applied less well. And I think that's actually a very acute observation. The sort of more show and tell we do about what the more sort of kind of stylized combat we do tends to promote heat rather than light. And I think what media consumers need is light rather than heat. But there's a whole bunch of incentives that push us in another direction. Anyway, that's the short version of a very
and that's a great way to think about it too, like light shining a light on what's happening, not heat as in just the conflict and the it's a great way of putting it. I have just put a link for people wanting to buy Katharine's quarterly essay in the chat. We've got a supporter discount for Australia Institute supporters, so you can find that and order that today. And good to hear that you kind of touch on it in there. I haven't read it yet, but I will before next week, Katharine. I do think kind of, Pete, you've picked up with, your report card on how you went with the federal election, like post-elections and the end of the year is kind of when we do that review of how the year kind of has gone and what we have to learn.
I think the major parties are both doing their reviews. I don't know if they'll be released publicly or not, but
party reviews.
Yeah.
Look, just quickly again, not to detain us, I think the Liberal Party executive is being briefed this week on the sort of main thrust of where that will end up. I don't think they've said one way or another about whether or not they intend to release the review, but I assume they will release some or part of it, perhaps between now and the end of the year. In terms of Labor, because it's been less relevant in my mind. I don't actually know whether Labor plans to do the same. Obviously, they had a very big review after 2019, and that was released publicly. So yeah, I'm not sure actually what their plans are.
Before we kind of come back to the end of year and federal politics, I did just want to take a little bit more time on the Victorian election and just ask you both, I guess, the big lessons out of that, because that's 2 elections now where the coalition, I mean, obviously Labor won government in both of those, but to me, the big story was kind of the tanking of the coalition and how big of a problem that is going forward. As you said, Katharine, you know, that's probably the more interesting one for people, as 2019 was for Labor. If I can start with you, Katharine, what did you take out of that election result?
In Victoria, yeah, well, look, as you say, Eb, there's been 2 very bad election results for the Liberal Party. The National Party survived both contests in better nick than their Liberal partners. I think the Liberal Party has a genuine problem in sort of inner metropolitan Australia. The Liberal Party is in danger of becoming a regional-based party, and the reasons for that, I think, have been articulated by a number of Liberals, that the party needs to sort of get back in touch with its original sort of philosophical underpinnings rather than being dazzled by transient culture war. So that's a real thing. I do think there was one interesting inflection point between the 2 contests, if I can just hang a tiny lantern over that. Obviously, the Teal candidates did not do as well in Victoria as they did federally, and there's a bunch of reasons for that. There are spending caps in Victoria, for example, that don't exist federally. There's been some debate about respective candidates in the contest, which I'm not fully across because I don't really know the Victorian people. So there's those things. But also, while the Liberal Party performed very poorly in the Victorian election, the Liberal Party did, or on current indications, hold some key territory in terms of just the teal battlegrounds, if I can express it in those terms. Certainly, there's been a lot of discussion about, an imminent comeback for Josh Frydenberg based on the Victorian election result, because if you sort of look at the state seats that sit in his electorate of Kooyong, the heartland Liberal seats, or the Liberal areas in that electorate, actually held for the Liberal Party in Victoria, whereas obviously that didn't happen federally. Now, I'm speculating because obviously I'm not close enough to the Victorian contest to understand the dynamics in detail, but I just note for this audience, which is very, very interested in these things, that the state Liberal Party in Victoria has a much better climate policy than the federal Liberal Party took to the last election, and certainly since the change of leader to Peter Dutton, who has actually regressed their position from Scott Morrison's position on climate. So I wonder to what extent the Liberal and National parties, and both of them in Victoria, having a better climate policy than their federal counterparts, to what extent that made a difference in some of those contests. But in a general sense, the Liberal Party has a huge task to work out how it's going to position itself. And I guess my fear for them is that the sort of definitional process that they'll need to embark upon in this term of government will be heavily influenced by their current representation. And a number of sort of city moderates were wiped out in the federal election, the last federal election. So you just sort of got to think about this if you're a group of people sitting around thinking, well, what do we do now, right? If your current sort of representation in the parliament is less diverse than it has been in the past, you will have a less diverse conversation than you otherwise would have had. But anyway, that's definitely another one of those watch this space things for, how they respond to these 2 elections, both the federal one and the Victorian one.
Yeah, Pete, did you have any lessons from?
Yeah, look, I'm up here in Sydney on Gadigal land, so I wasn't close to it. One observation from the cheap seats, though, is that I reckon one of the things that Albanese's done federally has been to take a lot of anger out of politics in general. So a lot of what drove the momentum of the federal election was anger at Scott Morrison. And I think a lot of what drove the Teal success was anger at an individual. And obviously, individuals are always an abstraction. That they're an embodiment of a bunch of policies, but also the way the individual carries on. And I think we can underestimate how much the mood around politics has changed. So I saw what was going on in Victoria, and the Libs almost trying to run Dan Andrews as Scott Morrison as the bad leader we need to get out. And the anger wasn't in the room. And like my friends in Victoria, even progressive friends, would say, gee, it's got too far with state control. And I think there is a little bit of a kernel of truth, but it's not an angry centre that could drive a change of government. And if I look at what the situation is up here in New South Wales, where there's a state election in March, again, I think it'll be a challenge for Labor. While a lot of the portents are good for a change of government, the anger's not there. And in a way, that's really good, unless you're trying to dislodge a government. Like, I quite like the absence of anger in our political discourse at the moment. But if it's not there, the way of winning a campaign against a government that has all the advantages of incumbency is much harder. So we'll see how the New South Wales Labor Party goes up here. But I do think that was probably the other false flag in this election, that people just saw it as a natural follow-on of getting rid of Morrison. They'd get rid of incumbent state governments.
Had myself on mute. You
Behind
think
the
I know
dreams.
what I'm doing after 2.5 years of doing this, but never mind. I've got a few questions from the audience here, but just to start off with, a couple of them are on the Nationals Party, and one is asking, what do you think is behind the Nationals' gains in Victoria? And another one, Katharine, is asking specifically about the Nationals' announcement that they're going to oppose Voice.
Mm-hmm.
What is the kind of motivation behind this? Is the nature of the question, I guess.
Yeah, okay. Well, Nats in Victoria, I'm not entirely qualified to make a judgment about that, so I might just defer on the basis of just not having enough information. In terms of the federal, the Voice decision, look, I think obviously Jacinta Price, who is a new representative who came in at the federal election, sits in the Nationals Party room. She has some very strong views, negative views about the Voice. I think that's a factor. I think both in the Liberal and National parties, there is a very strong cohort of MPs who will not accept this proposition, whatever the model. Doesn't matter if it's symbolic or whether it's substantive. That has been a long settled feature of this debate. It's one of the reasons why this debate about recognition has gone on for more than a decade, is because there is a hard group in both the Liberal and National parties who will not countenance constitutional change, whether minimalist or maximalist. So that's a sort of resting predisposition. I think there is some speculation around some of the Indigenous leadership that basically this has been a push by the Queensland Nationals or elements of the Queensland Nationals. I think the base, the National Party base, sort of whipped up by precursor campaigns by some think tanks, are opposed, and I'm talking about party members. I'm not talking about regional Australians. I'm talking about the minority of people who are members of political parties. So I think there is a view around the Indigenous leadership that this is sort of bubbled up via Queensland, that Jacinta Price has sort of been the forward offence on say no to the Voice in terms of the Nats, and for whatever reason, the Nats have basically thought it necessary to articulate their position now. And obviously, at one level, it's ridiculous, given that we don't really have, there's we've got the sentences that the Prime Minister proposes to add to the Constitution, but the referendum is at a very nascent stage. We're not actually going to be in full tilt referendum territory until the next financial year. Why the Nats have had to come out and say this with such strength at this point in time suggests to me that there is a base pressure issue on the leader. And that's, I think, why we've seen this early articulation of the Nationals' position on this. Noel Pearson, who's obviously a key driver, mover and shaker in The Voice and the Uluru Statement, made some observations about this on Radio National this morning, which I'm sure people on the pod and the webinar will be interested to go and listen back to. If you've not heard that interview, that you can download that on the RN website. He was obviously very critical of this decision at this point in time. And obviously too, in terms of internal coalition dynamics, which I think are also possibly part of the story here. I think we have seen David Littleproud as Nationals leader acting very much as a Nationals leader, rather than the sort of sometimes master-servant relationship of the Liberal and National parties in coalition. I think we've seen on a number of occasions since the election, Littleproud taking a Nationals position, whether or not that suited Peter Dutton. Yeah, we've seen that in small ways, and now we're seeing it in a big way. So I suspect that's also part of the story.
Yeah, Pete, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, look, I dug out some numbers for one of Katharine's colleagues, Carla Walquist. I don't want to steal her scoop, but we just looked at some of the regional breakdowns on Voice from August, the last time we polled. Support for Voice at this point in rural areas is 57-43 in favour, and in provincial areas 66-34 in favour. Amongst coalition voters, it's 53-47 in favour. So this is not a call the National Party is making to reflect the will of the people it represents. It is a political calculation that it can create a sense of relevance by being the place where the outliers who want to not listen and accept the invitation from First Nations people to have a voice enshrined in the Constitution will gravitate around. And I reckon what's going on here also is, if it's not the Nats, it's going to be Pauline Hanson, because she's the first one that's put her hand up. So there's a little bit of brand differentiation between One Nation and the National Party going on here, but it is not a cost-neutral decision. This pushes them to the outskirts, the back blocks of mainstream Australia very, very quickly. And it is a massive call. The other thing that's interesting is, if you think about The Voice at the moment, there's the vast majority of people who would say there's been a process, First Nations people have come up with a model, they've made the invitation, we'll say yes, thank you for engaging, we would love a way that we can make better policy. And there's two sides to the argument. One is that it's not going to do anything, which is kind of more a progressive argument, that it's just performative. And the other one, which says that it's setting up a special case for one race. The Nationals are arguing both cases at once. Like, it's not even that they've got a coherent reason to vote no, they've just decided that we're going to be the no people, and the no people aren't going to be the outliers of One Nation, they're going to be the outliers of the National Party. So massive call. I think the way that the campaign's handling it, more in sadness than in anger, that a major party could be so tone deaf, is it the right way to play it and to open the door for them to reevaluate? If we get to the position where, you know, you've got 70% of regional Australia supporting The Voice, will the National Party really stand in the way? I don't know. It's early days, as Katharine said.
Well, I think just very quickly, Eb, I just think Pete's point there about One Nation is actually really important because Pauline Hanson has been publicly goading Peter Dutton on this on this point. And obviously the National Party has got sort of competition coming from both their right and left flank. We see in issues like this, we've seen it in climate change, where the National Party is not representative of their communities. And as I said before, this is a base issue. This is not an issue of who the National Party is representing. This is a sort of like, you know, an articulation on the part of a very small
values.
well, you know, it's a cohort thing, right? So it's sort of it'd be interesting to see how they'd sort of try and thread that needle. But I do think Hanson's a significant factor as well. Yeah.
Pete, I've got a couple of questions in here about Twitter and the implosion thereof, and where you think all that is headed, if everyone's migrating to Mastodon, or, you know, what's happening on that front in the tech space. And I guess I only ask because I feel like in Australia, a lot of the political discourse happens on Twitter. Journalists are there, politicians are there. It is where a lot of engagement happens. It is part of our public square, for better or worse, privately owned now by Elon Musk.
Well, 2 Sundays ago, when they put Donald Trump, or they withdrew the ban, I followed one of the Twitter handles that I've always respected a lot, Tweet of God, who deactivated their account, and I followed God off Twitter. So I'm deactivated for 31 days, and I must say it's been a refreshing break, not trying to think that every dad joke needs to be shared with the world. I've been looking at Mastodon, which is quite a complex thing to set up. There's another one called Post, which looks really interesting, that's got a 120,000 person waiting list. So there's no obvious place to go, but I'm kind of decompressing for a month just to reflect. And you know, with our Burning Platforms podcast that we run through the Centre for Responsible Technology, we have been thinking through, how do you build community that is not just a ubiquitous open field? Like, do you need mass platforms, or should we be more focused on building community? So one of the things we're thinking through at the moment is, where would we like to build a community around people who like talking about tech issues, maybe not in 140 characters? Do we move back to discussion boards? Are there better ways of building that sense of engagement than just everyone jumping on the one platform and trying to build massive lists? Now, I've only got 5.5 followers. Catherine's reach is much bigger, so the cost for her following God off the dumpster is going to be a lot higher. But I just think that once you've got an owner who seems dedicated to breaking all the rules and norms and getting rid of all their staff, I just don't feel good being there at the moment. So I'm just having a break.
Katharine, I'm not sure if you want to weigh in on that, or I can move to the next question.
No, quickly. It's I've sort of it's sort of one of those sort of slow moving car crashes, sort of Elon Musk. It's kind of like I've sort of seen it coming at us, and I haven't really had time to really sort of absorb what was going on. I did at one point when I was overseas with the Prime Minister, I did. It was a day where in the G20 Media Centre in Bali, there was a lot of conversation among journalists about whether Twitter would fall over that day, whether or not it would continue to function because of the exodus. And I did, I think, say to my followers, look, if it all falls over, it's been sweet. See you somewhere else.
You're more Moses than God. Like, you need to take your people with you somewhere, Katharine.
I love this idea about following God. I mean, God would be so pleased if I followed him. But anyway, I do love that idea. No, look, I haven't made any decisions about this yet. Not because I'm sort of confused about the fundamentals, but I just haven't had time to focus on it. So I do remain on Twitter at this point in time. And we'll sort of see how it goes. It is a difficult sort of space to replicate, because it is, I mean, as Eb said, Twitter is a hub for, well, not only, a political discussion in Australia, it's a hub for political discussion around the world, which is sort of why Donald Trump focused on it so what's the word, forensically, I guess, in terms of the audience or the platform that it gave him. It also, in the olden times, although it does this less well now, was the fastest news aggregator anywhere, breaking news aggregator anywhere, which is part of the reason a lot of journalists are on the platform, because it basically brings you, a very, very real-time feed of breaking news all around the world. So, what comes afterwards? Well, I don't know. I mean, who knows? I don't know. But anyway, obviously, I will use the Christmas period to reflect on where one should be in the social space. But I just haven't had the bandwidth to work out whether I should or shouldn't be there at this point.
Well, yeah, I tried to sign up for Mastodon and it all got a bit complicated and I gave up and just thought I'd stay on Twitter until something easier emerged. But I did, Katharine, want to ask you, for the last poll position, you were away with the Prime Minister travelling overseas. We know that he had a side meeting with the Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, but what else emerged from that trip?
Oh, it was such a fascinating trip. I thought it would be good. I thought it would be interesting just because of the sort of the number of issues, both regionally, globally and domestically, that would sort of intersect during that summit season. But it was actually more sort of interesting and revelatory than I expected. I think obviously the sort of stabilisation of the China relationship was Australia's objective going in. And the Prime Minister achieved the first steps in that, although, how on earth you keep that relationship on track is, well, maybe God, sad he's left Twitter, maybe God could help us with, understanding how one stabilises a relationship with an authoritarian dictatorship, but difficult.
Mastodon, I think. So if you can.
Oh, there you go. Okay, I'll go over there and ask him. But no, look, I mean, I'm being a bit flippant. Obviously, it doesn't. One meeting doesn't solve all the irritants and problems in the relationship. And also, the sort of the fascinating thing really was China's decision during the summit season to sort of to re-engage at some level with the world, mostly positively in terms of the Biden meetings and certainly the meeting with our own Prime Minister, negatively in the case of Justin Trudeau. I'm sure a lot of people will have seen that video that emerged of the confrontation they had on the sidelines. Beyond China, I just think lots of my critical kind of takeaway from it was actually optimistic. Now, Pete and Eb and I have known one another all for a long time. I think Eb and Pete are well aware that I'm a natural pessimist. However, what the best thing for me from my vantage point during summit season was watching the world trying to work. And we did see that across a number of levels in those different summits. We saw ASEAN countries try and place some pressure on a military junta in Myanmar. Like we did see that in an ASEAN context. We saw, a certain amount of positioning, for rules and norms. We saw the world at large rallying for Ukraine and their continuing difficulties repelling an illegal invasion. There was a truly hairy moment at the G20 where there was a missile misadventure that, in Poland that killed a couple of civilians, where Joe Biden literally convened a scratch meeting of the G7 on the sidelines of the G20. And for a couple of hours, we really didn't know whether we were in an Article 5 NATO scenario where that conflict was going to escalate into a full-blown confrontation. Extraordinary few hours to witness at close range. Fortunately, it didn't land that way. Fortunately, more information surfaced that the missile that landed on the Polish farmhouse was actually caused by an interception by a Ukrainian defense system. But that was honestly one of the more extraordinary couple of hours I've witnessed. And it was amazing to be there. My sort of positive take out of summit season was watching the world trying to work. So in the spirit of the last show and Christmas and everything else, look, there's some positivity from Katharine Murphy.
There it is.
Peace on earth.
Could
Ebony, that we did have a few slides on China. I don't know if you want to go back to them because it just sort of reinforces that, I think. Influence of China on different, so the right-hand column here is the latest number, but you can see that, you know, from 2019 through to 2022, big drop through the pandemic on issues like culture, trade, defence, and Australia's politics, but stabilising somewhat. If you go to the next one, influence the US compared to the influence of Australia. Again, the positivity, like obviously we see ourselves much more positively aligned with America than China, unsurprising. But go to the next one, and there's a degree of optimism, 46 to 9, saying things will get better rather than get worse with the change of government. And then the last one, which is really interesting to me in the, particularly with respect to the way the coalition plays things, and it's been one we've had before. The vast majority, 54%, want to see opportunities to rebuild relations. Only 13% are looking for a more confrontational approach, 12% status quo, 21% unsure. I just think they're really interesting anchor points in understanding the way that our Prime Minister is dealing with China and the way that it's all playing out in the region at the moment.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot to take away from it. And it has, I think, changed, the way Australians think about that relationship as well. Because I do recall that at certain times when trade was going really well with China, there was a whole bunch of people and politicians who really didn't seem to give two hoots about China's human rights record. And now we see a lot more attention on that kind of stuff. But I think that's been a function of the other ructions and disruptions in that relationship. But it is a huge one. So it does make sense that a lot of the country would be wanting to see more positive steps happening there. And that was, really amazing reflection, Katharine. I can't imagine what it would be like there, where you were wondering whether or not things were about to heat up, very unfortunately, in Ukraine there. But so often thinking about those things in terms of just a talk fest, but something like that would make you realize how much actually is at stake there.
Yeah, no, it was genuinely amazing, and obviously I was filled with the most profound relief, obviously, when we weren't escalating in that direction, but it was, it's quite something, because it's sort of the whole backdrop to summit season. Of course, they are trailing talk fests that are populated by a whole lot of interest groups as well as leaders. I can understand why people might be fatigued with the whole demonstration of that. But it was, the fascinating thing journalistically, when you do summit season, is that you are briefly enclosed in spaces with people who literally determine the trajectory of the world that we live in. And sometimes there are crisis points that enable you to see that statecraft playing out in real time, and it was certainly one of those occasions.
We're nearly out of time, but Katharine, I did just want to ask you, I guess, about climate change and energy, just to finish us up, because we're about to go into our third La Nina summer. We're already experiencing floods again. The war in Ukraine is causing electricity prices to go up on coal and gas, which is helping with the cost of living crunch. But there's a lot of interactions, I guess, between climate and energy and electricity. How much do you think the government is using this cost of living crisis to help drive forward its climate agenda, or are they still quite separate where the government's coming from?
Oh, no, I think you are, as you always are, Eb, you are acute in making that point. I think there is a crossover, obviously, between the transition agenda that the government has in terms of the transition to low emissions and the cost of living crunch that we're living at the moment. The danger politically that the government is weathering by sort of tying the two narratives together, the story of the transition with the story of cheaper energy options, is because we see Peter Dutton attempting sort of to apply a redux of the Tony Abbott carbon price strategy, where you basically you pull climate action out of the necessary science fact basket and you put it in the bill we can't afford basket, where it's just all too hard, it'll cost too much, it's too disruptive, and the lights will go off and everybody will, have to mortgage their homes in order to pay their power bills. So I think the Labor Party, having been to this rodeo once or twice before, is at pains to sort of pull those two stories together in terms of what they're talking about, in part because obviously cost of living is when you get when you get acute cost of living pressure, that is always the most difficult political environment, to achieve steps forward to deal with a climate crisis. So look, I think the two are inextricably linked. In terms of looking ahead at what's sort of going to happen, look, Chris Bowen has had an incredibly busy year, legislating a target, legislating the tax cut for EVs. There's a whole big body of work being done on the safeguard mechanism, which I think we'll see a government response between now and Christmas. And that's quite substantive and important. I think the first sort of step in that safeguard transformation we'll see in the Parliament this week. I think some legislation will be introduced giving effect to a crediting mechanism, which I won't bore people with, but that's quite an important element of it. I think we'll see that this week. Also this week, we will see the first statement on the climate by Chris Bowen. I think, don't hold me to this, I think from memory it's on Thursday. That will basically involve two elements. It's obviously Chris Bowen reporting to Parliament on progress, but also there'll be some research from the Climate Change Authority about how we're tracking on our climate goals, which is one of the things associated with the targets commitment earlier in the year. So I think all of those things come together on Thursday. Please don't sue me if I'm wrong, because there's a lot in my head at the moment, but I think that's what we expect, that we'll see that on Thursday. So that'll be interesting as well.
Yeah, and as you said, we've got the NAC bill. Like there's lots of other things happening, but that one in particular, people have been waiting to see what the government would come up with there. So a lot of beady eyes anticipating that response. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. We are going to have to wrap up. Don't forget, this will go up on the Australia Institute's YouTube page later today. It will become The Guardian's Australian Politics podcast tomorrow. So you can tune in there if for whatever reason you need to listen back to something that we've said today. And don't forget to head on over to Essential for a deep dive into all those poll results. And of course, Katharine and Peter's analysis is on Guardian Australia today. So I recommend that you check both of those out. One last reminder before we speak to Katharine next week, that there is a supporter discount available for Australia Institute supporters on the new quarterly essay that Katharine has written, Lone Wolf. And you can join us next Tuesday when we're going to talk to Katharine about that essay in more depth. But thank you so much for being with us all this year. We really appreciate you coming along for this ride every fortnight. I can't even remember how the year started out, to be honest, but I don't think we were at war with Ukraine when we first, there was a war in Ukraine when we started. So it has been an incredibly big year. Thank you to Katharine and to Pete and for all of you for all your time this year.
Hey, Ebony, before we go, can we thank you as well for running the ship of state through the year? It's been great fun. Can I also just jump in two little ads? We are contemplating doing an evening Zoom over drinks with the final Essential report, and we'll let people know if we go ahead with that. And also, if you're in Melbourne on December 13, we're going to be doing drinks in the Trades Hall for Centre for Responsible Technology. So if you're interested in any of those, we'll find a way off Twitter of getting in touch with you.
Thanks very much, everyone. And yeah, still a couple more webinars to go, but signing off for pole position, and we hope to see you again next year. And yeah, thanks very much, everyone. Enjoy these last couple of days of sitting, and we'll see you when we see you. Take care out there.